Welcome to Data Myths Podcast with your hosts, Brian and Melinda Gagnon.
So, a little about us. I'm interested in how tech helps us improve our lives. I have 20 years experience in digital communications. I'm an ex-Googler and now help launch new companies and products.
And I've spent 20 plus years evangelizing tech at some of the world's largest companies. Whether you're a dataphile or a dataphobe, we have something for you on this podcast. So get ready. Let's go.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I am pretty awesome.
You're just coming off from some travel.
Yeah.
Are you recovered?
I am recovered. I spent a little time out in Seattle, so that was fun. New portfolio company that we're working with, and got a chance to run all over Seattle and see
some sunshine too, huh?
It was incredible. It's actually the first time that I've been there for a contiguous week where it didn't rain at least once. So.
And Bill Gates gave a shout out to that when he introduced Melinda Gates in her last stop of her book tour by saying he was surprised people showed up because it was actually sunny in Seattle.
Yeah, and so I'm sad that I missed that, because if I had known about that, I would have gone. But I was there for a Techstars event, so that was good. And yeah, I got to walk around the Amazon megaplex called Seattle.
Very cool. Which brings us to our mega topic for today, which is to talk about Amazon and how massive they are and what that means as they spread out into so many different industries and services, and how that's affecting us all in our day-to-day lives. And it's amazing because I think the majority of people may not know how much they work with Amazon actually on a day-to-day basis.
I was pretty surprised. I will say their dog park was pretty pathetic. And with how big Amazon is, I saw their dog park outside of one of their buildings, and come on, guys, like that was barely a dog park.
However, having visited their headquarters a few times for different things, they do have a great doggy daycare. It's indoors, so it might not go noticed, but yes, they have on-site doggy care. They're very four-legged friendly. Wow, that was hard to say.
Yeah, nice.
But that's one of the things I absolutely love about Amazon. You see the parade of dogs walk in to headquarters every morning, and they do that every day because they stop by the reception desk and wait for their little treat, and then they continue into the office. It's very cool.
Well, let's dive in, right? So Amazon has grown sufficiently large, Microsoft large from back in the 90s. What do you want to talk about today?
Let's do a little survey of where the heck they are, because they are everywhere. And to be perfectly honest, I don't even think we can do it justice to cover. I certainly know we can't do it justice to cover every place that they are today. But just to give a little walkthrough on the main areas that Amazon is playing right now and some upcoming areas that might be a little surprising. So we all know clearly as a retail giant.
Yeah, that's a no-brainer, right?
Right.
Prime
so we'll talk about that. Definitely their play with cloud computing, AWS. They have a huge presence now as a grocer, right? So brick and mortar locations. They not only have the retail presence, the e-commerce presence, but the whole distribution infrastructure to support that.
Atlas Air, that's the trucks, the last mile of delivery.
Warehouses.
Exactly.
Advanced robotics inside the warehouses to pack boxes. They are proving to be a pretty formidable player in the advertising space. That business is growing rapidly and eating a little bit of Google's lunch. What else? They're into news. Obviously, owners of the Washington Post doing some interesting new things that we'll, can talk more about there. With Amazon Prime, they're huge in entertainment. They're creating original content, huge investments there.
The list
is going on and on.
They own IMDb too. So they're.
Yes. So this was something that is so surprising. It's almost, it's been there for so long This is one of those that you forget about. They acquired them in 1998
Wow.
for 55 million. And when you think back of where Amazon was in 1998, they were starting to sell books. Why in heck did they want IMDb? I guess just to flesh out some information about entertainment content. But it's very puzzling. And this could be a whole nother chat in and of itself to look at all their acquisitions and try to get in Bezos's head to say, wait a minute, there was no writing on the wall for why this was important. And is this an early indicator of what he was building ultimately? But so yeah, IMDb is in there. And then we have home automation, intelligent home stuff.
So Ring, Alexa, the whole 9 yards.
And then huge gaming play. So not only we have this original content, but they own Twitch. So
interesting.
So, and there are other areas so that they're into. I mean, they're even talking about, you said PillPack earlier, we were talking.
Yeah.
Is that an acquisition or?
Yeah, they acquired PillPack a few months back.
So we're getting into the medical space. So, this is all coming together to say, okay, well, Amazon is starting to touch pretty much every piece of our day or our interests or what we need. And even if it's nothing overt, maybe simply the data we're sharing is being stored, and processed by AWS. Or, when we start to use our smart home devices, that is getting plugged into a much larger network that's doing things that have externalities that we maybe didn't anticipate. So this is part of us thinking about, well, what does this mean for us? And, there's been a lot of talk about antitrust. Is Amazon a monopoly? And this starts to feed into that whole conversation.
Well, so a traditional definition of a monopoly or an antitrust situation is where you start to affect pricing as it affects the consumer. And so I think one of the challenges today is that prices seem to have never been cheaper, whether it be an airline, right? And if you look at all of the places where industry has consolidated over the last 20, 30 years, airlines, there's fewer airlines than ever. There are fewer, options for buying stuff from big retailers. Grocery stores have consolidated. The list goes on. Main Street has died off a bit. The mall has died off a bit. And traditional retailers have died off as a result of both of those.
And a lot of people are saying, oh, that's the Amazon effect. And when you have a term coined like that, that's definitely a PR problem for Amazon. And it used to be really the focus was the Walmart effect when you talked about the effect that it had on Main Street. And now Amazon is coming head on to really try to debunk the quote unquote Amazon effect by saying things like, well, wait a second, 90% of sales still happen offline, which is true.
Right.
However, 50% of e-commerce sales come from Amazon.
That's a huge number.
So yeah, they're still significant. We get it, Mr. Bezos, that you're not dominating every purchase in the country, but it's still significant.
Yeah. And what I would say is, so if you take and apply that traditional monopoly measure, right, prices have actually gone down. Airline tickets have never been cheaper, and there's less airlines. Granted, Amazon's not in that space yet. Shipping costs have actually gone down considerably. There's less.
Is that because of fuel prices, though?
Some of that might be fuel prices, but I think the
Rather than
actual
consolidation.
Yeah, I think some of the actual act of shipping and, it being a lot more, automated with robots and such,
Absolutely.
That's really reduced the price. Then you've got the store, the online store, Amazon or what have you, has actually brought the price down on a lot of goods. So if we're looking at it from the perspective of lock-in and the platform and all of that, it looks like they're not doing something so bad
In terms of serving the customer.
in terms of serving the customer and pricing, right? Because pricing has been sort of that key.
Right, right. So if we think about the main arguments for a monopoly, when it comes to antitrust, it's really not all about size, right? It's really about
Oh, size doesn't matter now, you're saying?
correct.
Okay.
So, but it's not just about how much of the market they control. It's if they're actually doing something to the detriment of the customer. So meaning, are they unfairly raising prices? Now, some people could argue, well, yes, because they're controlling so much of the e-commerce experience on their own platform, they can actually crowd out less expensive product simply by promoting their own product more.
Well,
That is an argument.
Well, and the flip side of it too is that they could say that with AWS or with the Amazon platform, the store platform, they've reduced the price of bringing goods to market because a startup can really easily go build a store or build all the infrastructure that they need to build a store cheaper than ever.
Right.
So the barrier to entry to get in the market is lower than ever, arguably.
True. And there are other people who actually argue that no, it is the size that makes this a dangerous presence in the marketplace because it dominates so much of the experience. And if you just to continue using the retail sales portion, one thing that Amazon is really proud of is the fact that most of their retail sales come from sellers paying Amazon to use their infrastructure. So when you think about that, they're starting to control that entire loop, right? From hosting the site with the product information, promoting the product on site, providing that customer experience, understanding the shopping experience on site, all the way through to purchase, the reviews that come along with that. That is a really powerful ecosystem.
This is kind of like that time we took that bus tour out to the pyramids in Mexico. We got on the bus.
This was to Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City.
Yeah, and we got on the bus and we got going, and then we stopped off miraculously at this food place, which was owned, later we figured it out, that was owned by the bus company or the tour company. And then we went a little further and, let's stop off and do some shopping. And we stopped off there and, they hustled us through there, and come to find out that also was owned by the bus company. And cruise ships do the same thing. They buy an island and build out infrastructure on the island and completely control price.
Yeah, and every step of the way, the experience is controlled and curated and optimized. And here's this optimization point that when you control a whole experience, you can optimize it because you have all the information. You have the control to make changes to make it work better. And by virtue of that, you can absolutely reduce cost, reduce friction, improve the customer experience. So here lies the rub, you see, with
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
They're big, which brings control, which allows them to understand and optimize and improve, which can better the customer experience. You could take that size, that information to unfairly raise prices or do other things to detriment or stifle competition. So this topic of are they a monopoly? It's extremely complex, and it actually gets down to their different market segments to truly look at the activity, because the answer that exists in the marketing advertising space is going to be different than cloud computing. It's going to be different from entertainment to their news org. They're very different businesses.
Well, and I would say it's interesting because if you look at AWS and the cloud and providing infrastructure, one of the studies that I saw was that, sure, the cloud is actually reducing prices over traditionally putting stuff on premises. Excuse me, geez, on premises. However, it's actually not reducing it as fast as the cost of the technology. So when you look at that gap, we're getting quickly to a point where if you're savvy and have the skills and ability, you could almost build something cheaper on site now because the cost is dropping fast. And Amazon is not sharing all of that cost reduction. And so that's point one. So creating services ensure the price is actually going down. However, it's going down for everybody in that ecosystem. And if there are fewer people to take advantage of the cost reduction, that's kind of hiding in there. The other piece is if you have a sufficiently large organization, you can control the cost of employment. You can control cost of the labor force and sufficiently suppress the labor force. That's another way that you can monopolize, right?
Absolutely. And so you're saying that Amazon is not passing their savings on to customers when it comes to AWS, and what they're trying to capitalize on, I'm guessing, is the convenience factor. That you don't need so many either consultants to help you or in-house tech resources to have your own environment.
Yeah, and some of the argument for the cloud has always been, and I think that the cloud makes sense in a lot of places. However, when you get to the point of sufficient size and your low water mark of what you need is sufficiently large, meaning I have this data or I have compute resources that I need to use for my business every single day of every single year. Not, if I'm a retailer, not in November and December when things are going crazy and the website's blowing up and I need 400% more compute and resources. I'm talking every single, Monday in the middle of April, whatever that horsepower is, if you have a sufficiently large organization where you can, build in durability and resiliency and your business plan and model, it makes sense probably to be looking at having that on your own premises versus just putting everything in the cloud, because you have to manage it anyway today. So that's point one. Point two to this is a different example, right? And to step back, I know we've talked a lot about Uber and ride sharing and gig economy, et cetera.
In our last podcast.
Podcast. Okay. And so when I got to Seattle, I decided, hey, what the heck? I will follow these 6 signs to the rideshare area and see how this will go. And I knew roughly how it was going to go. And so I follow these signs. I walk past the taxi stand, which, by the way, had a pretty short line. And I got into, the 3rd or 4th story of the garage and the parking garage, some dark alleyway with about 200 other people. And there were no less than 40 different queues that cars could pull into. And so then I put in my request and then I wait. And of course, the car that's coming to pick me up is a gray Prius. Do you know how many other gray Priuses were picking people up? Like every other Uber was a gray Prius. And so it was chaos. And I get thinking about it, and it's like, this is a lot like the argument for cloud in a way. And that there are times where the cloud just doesn't make sense. If you have enough, of a demand, why wouldn't you just send the cars there, right? And so now I'm waiting and I'm watching my car drive around the loop at the airport. And I asked the guy later, hey, why were you driving around? oh, a police officer like waved me around, so I had to drive around the loop a couple times before I could come into this area because it was so congested. Meanwhile, I could have gone down to the taxi stand, which has a very different model, which is we're going to put 20 taxis over there, and the taxis just keep coming. And if there's a line of resources, meaning passengers that need servicing, just keep sending yellow things with four wheels.
Right. Yeah. And there's typically someone there with a radio who actually says, calls the cab company and says, hey, send more cabs,
Exactly.
right? We're light.
Yeah. So that's a very different resource model than everyone demanding their, on-demand resource, AKA Uber or Lyft or whatever else. And it just didn't work. And so I thought about that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. It actually compares quite readily to cloud and sort of having on-demand resources in the cloud versus if you're using it and you're always going to be using it, you could get cost benefit by having your own resources.
And that's such an interesting topic. And I would love to talk more about that in another podcast about when does it make sense to either shift from cloud to on-prem, and when does it make sense to have both, and how do we think about all of that?
It always makes
game?
sense. Yeah, absolutely. But to answer that question, it always makes sense for the most part to have both.
Okay.
Right. It's sort of like running a consulting firm and not having some contracted help, right? You don't have that elastic if you don't do that. So, just something to think about. And yes, I agree. Let's carry on. Amazon, Monopoly, go.
Okay. All right, cool. So let's see. What else with Amazon? All right, ads. Let's go there. So when we think about what they're doing in that space, it's growing really quickly. And they're starting to erode a little bit of what Google is after, especially when it comes to search ads. So little disclaimer here. So I worked at Google in ad tech. When I went to WPP, I then worked with Amazon and advised them on their search product. So little disclaimer here that I've been in the walls of these companies, and WPP is the world's largest ad buyer. Recently, in the past year, to give an example of how big this is. So Amazon is projected this year just to be at $11 billion in ad revenue. And when you think about how that breaks out, WPP, the world's largest ad buyer, spent about $300 million on behalf of customers on Amazon search ads last year. And they said, and this is not inside information, this is publicly available information, 75% of that came from Google search budgets. So they're managing these budgets on behalf of clients. And search as a whole is a bucket, right? This is search exposure. This is how we're reaching users who are actively asking for my product information. And to manage these dollars, Amazon is considered in the same light as Google when it comes to search ad buying. Amazon is another search engine.
That's incredible to me.
And
where does it rank? So I know Google search is at the top, followed by, I think, YouTube. Is that correct? Is that its own search?
Oh, YouTube is a search engine as well that absolutely has to be optimized, certainly for organic search. And when it comes to why Amazon is so important in this ecosystem, I mean, one, it's because people go there to research products. Think about all of the fantastic product information that's there in their reviews. Not only can you research a product, well, it's the full ecosystem. You can also buy the product. So when you look at search queries, it's so valuable because half of search queries when it comes to product research actually starts on Amazon.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is. So advertisers, so these big brands know this.
Can I cut in for a sec on that?
Yeah.
Like I don't think about it for certain things. So electronics, I no longer think of Amazon because I've had some bad electronics purchases, I feel like so many reviews are just either canned or cooked or whatever you want to call it, cheesed. The system is cheesed, as a gamer would say. And I sort of stopped using Amazon for purchasing electronics and really researching electronics because I just feel like a lot of their information is out of date, or if there's multiple versions of things, it seems to get lost in the system. So B&H, where I've bought photo gear from forever, has really stepped up their game, tend to have really great reviews, really meaningful input from people that have actually bought the product. So I spent a lot of time over there. And again, not an ad, just a personal buying behavior. And so I find myself going to some of these other locations mainly because it's just as easy to buy there and they seem to have a lot better data.
Right. And from being an expert in those certain product areas where you like to go get your information. And that will always be present for consumers who really have a good understanding of the product category that they're engaging with. And to provide a little context on this whole Amazon Google thing, even though Amazon is creeping in there and their ad business is growing rapidly, Google still has the lion's share. I mean, they're at 78% of the US search ad market. So even though Amazon's creeping in and stealing some budget, they're not going anywhere. I mean, this is not a big upset right now, but it's something to be aware of because it is significant.
So let's draw one parallel before we get too far down the is this a monopoly path. Microsoft. So back in the 90s, Microsoft obviously went through antitrust actions and ultimately got, broken up a little bit. So part of that was about them taking Internet Explorer and the operating system and bundling it together with hardware so that people really didn't have a choice. I mean, it was really, really difficult to buy a Dell, for instance, that didn't have Microsoft bundled in. And inside of that bundle, there was also Internet Explorer. And so it was really, really difficult to have any choice around the internet browser. So fast forward to where we're at today. And that was fairly clear cut. They had over 90% of the market in desktop operating systems as well as server operating systems and browsing. So very different. I think that was very easy to measure, and it was very, very difficult to be anyone else. Netscape essentially went out of business as a result of this. I don't think they had a good business model. That's a whole different argument. But now we're into Amazon, and it's like Amazon is sort of keeping all of these different businesses on life support under the guise of, hey, it's not really a monopoly. But when we start thinking about the data that they have at their fingertips now, they have Alexa data. So they have voice prints from a ton of people. They have machine learning from those voice prints and the types of things that people ask for. It's arguable that they're probably listening when you don't say, hey, Alexa, do this thing.
And we have found that is the case. Amazon claims, of course, that they aren't recording unless it's activated. But there have been cases, for example, where their team that basically reviews Alexa responses, questions and responses to help train their AI algorithms have caught content where the user isn't necessarily aware that they're being recorded. So to say it doesn't happen, of course it happens, and not to say that is an intention of Amazon, but it's most certainly happens because the AI is not perfect. It's learning, and it mistakes words all the time. That's why you hear these funny stories of, oh, Alexa just started laughing. Well, because it picked up on a word that it thought was Alexa laugh. And that's one thing that Amazon learned, and it updated the activation to say, Alexa, can you laugh? So it wouldn't make that mistake, and you have this creepy speaker all of a sudden laughing, when you don't know what's going on. So part of it is just where the technology is. But when you realize that could have some pretty unnerving consequences to think that you could be recorded and not know it.
Well, and so let's keep down the path. I don't want to really stop at any one spot too long if we can, because there's so much to cover, because these guys are
there's
huge.
So much.
So then you've got things like Ring, which is the doorbell that has the camera in it and you can control from anywhere. So while I was in Seattle last week, I saw a newspaper ad for a director of news for Ring. And
what is Ring doing with news?
Well, that's a great question. So I read down through the job description, and down towards the bottom of the job description, it talked about reporting crime off of Ring's video. So that would be taking video that someone, I guess, allows to be public from their doorbell and allowing someone to report the news on that. That's kind of creepy, but that's a whole different topic. So let's just keep moving.
And one other note before we move. So I know that there are also ways that communities share Ring information. So I have family in Albuquerque.
The whole place.
Albuquerque has, let's face it, a lot of activity, quote unquote, and their little neighborhood. I don't want to call it neighborhood watch, but the neighbors essentially share their information from Ring, so they can all know if there's creepy stuff going on in the neighborhood. So I find that quite helpful in terms of how you're applying this neighborhood information, but to bring it to the level and exposure of news seems strange to me.
Well, and if you think about it, right, where does, innocent until proven guilty go when they're reporting on news that hasn't actually technically been deemed a crime, investigated, or prosecuted?
Well, I mean, the media does that all the time. Something happened. Who knows what did it? But I mean, that gets us into the whole mess of what is news and, oh my goodness,
whatever happened to
Facebook, and are there, real editors nowadays, and shouldn't we have editors again? All of this stuff.
Yeah. So let's just keep going down the whole list, right? And so then you get into content creation and Prime Video. So now they're creating content. Now they're getting viewing and behavioral understanding of what you like to watch and all that. This is a ton of data. And when you're able to stitch it all together, this makes Google look like a saint as far as what they have access to.
Well, and I mean, let's not say sinner or saint in this conversation, because this could be all used for noble purposes. The danger is when one company has so much control that how are they stitching that all together to have this type of omnipotent view of what's happening in our country, what's happening among the people who are using their services, and that's where the whole monopoly thing starts to take a whole new light. That sure, this could have the most noble of reasons, and I have no reason to believe it doesn't. I'm not sitting here saying that Amazon is this conspiracy theory to rule the world or something. No, but when we know AI is imperfect, we know it's learning, we know that data breaches happen often. This starts to become a something that we should absolutely be paying attention to. Like, what are the safeguards with all of this?
Well, and every time there's a non-barrier, meaning all of these portfolio of companies that are under Amazon's watch are all able to share data back and forth and left and right and create machine learning models based on that really huge set of data without any controls, meaning they don't have to go outside and connect to Equifax, or they don't have to go talk to JP Morgan Chase to see banking data, or they don't have to go to ADT to see home data. And each time you go outside with something like that, you would think that there is some type of data policy in how they wish for you to use the data. And so there's some control. And I think when it's all under one umbrella, data becomes really, really large, and there's no like cost associated with that. And you're able to leverage that in such a way that people might not even understand how.
Yeah, it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. And, a really good example, I think, of how Amazon's information is starting to come to life in different ways. So back in 2017, they started testing their facial recognition platform called Rekognition with a police department in Washington State. And it's available for the officers to basically use a photo from anything that they have access to. They even can use it with a sketch of a description, which is not recommended by Amazon to do, but they're using that to help to find people's identity. And typically how that goes, they enter into the system, they have 5 different examples that, it could be this person. And then it's a matter of cross-referencing, just like in any investigation, right? Maybe there's a Facebook profile, and how does that connect to other publicly available information about their home address and so forth. And it has been used to prosecute people. And it's not as if that's the nail in the coffin, so to speak. It's part of the investigation. But that's also something to think about, is how this is starting to creep into these really important matters. And, there's been criticism that it doesn't do a good job of identifying African American faces and, people of color. So, these are all part of that, not only AI bias, but also how we want this information shared and accessed. Is this helping us, and is it operating in the way that we want it to?
Well, let's be clear. You really, with AI today, you definitely don't want to be a minority. You definitely don't want to be in the bottom third of anything, whether it be lending or something that someone deems not beneficial, because whether you should be there or shouldn't, you're probably getting classified or stereotyped, whether you like it or not. And that's a crying shame, because the great part about America, right, is that everybody has the same opportunity. Well, my big concern with AI is really that transparency of algorithm, and that it's making decisions not just on too many statistics, but also so that people have a fair shot at doing the same as others.
Right. And there's also, debate around, well, how safe of it is as well. Like, let's say that this is used to falsely identify a suspect. No one's saying this person is guilty, but still, you may have an officer showing up to someone's house, and there could be an element of danger there. I mean, we know that we've had a case recently where someone was killed by a police officer when they were mistakenly identified. And, this is not, I would say commonplace, but we still need to think about, is this enough to go on, and how it's being used? Because while Amazon has a few recommendations on how to use the platform, it's not as if it's hard and fast. I mean, it's open for them to use. They did like 1,000 searches last year in this particular, case.
Well, so I want to make it a little bit more about the data, and then we could kind of close out on sort of where this maybe is headed. So from a data perspective, if you look at all the things that we've spoken about so far and sort of that classic monopoly, here's the big place where we haven't quite seen yet. And I was just talking to some founders the other day, and they said the words, oh, well, data is so free and easy because it's getting created so many places. So we've built our model off of this free data over there. Well, my argument is that free data is going away, and that could be, access to different apps that share data with you that you could build an algorithmic model off of, et cetera. That stuff's going away, and as data gets monopolized, Amazon's going to be able to name whatever price they want on that data, or make it sufficiently hard for a startup to get their hands on that data. So it's a little bit less about money, because today we do a terrible job worldwide of putting a value on data. So Infonomics, the measure of value to data, we do a terrible job with that. There's not a great way to say this pile of data is worth this amount of money on the lifetime value of that data. And so as a result of that, it's sort of flying under the cover of radar of what this data is actually worth. And so my fear is that we get to a point that we're way far down the path. All this data has been collected. Fewer startups are starting up, even though the barriers to entry to build that infrastructure to start a startup should make it cheaper and easier. The real problem is getting access to data, and getting access to data moving forward is going to make or break a company, especially if they're talking about leveraging AI, machine learning, blockchain, or anything like that requires a ton of data to sufficiently build a good model.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we heard something that was pretty astonishing really last fall. It came from an Amazon all hands meeting when Bezos essentially said that Amazon's not too big to fail, and that he predicts that one day Amazon will fail. And he was really talking historically about the fact that big companies have a lifespan, and in his mind, that's really about 30 years. It's not 100 years. And part of that concern is around antitrust laws and potential government regulation that are concerns for him. So he certainly is to say he's a smart person. We all know that, and understanding what's happening in politics right now, and especially as all of our behemoths of technology companies are growing and accessing more and more information. So it will be interesting to see the next moves and if self-regulation will start to come into play.
I don't think self-regulation is going to work. I think we're past that point. I think that it's not just Amazon either. I really wanted to sort of open up and talk through this discussion from a term of not necessarily price consideration, as antitrust has typically been talked about, but about access to data and how data can actually drive decisioning down the road. So thank you very much for your time. I think this was a good conversation today.
Absolutely. Enlightening as always. Thank you, Brian. Thanks so much for listening. This episode is sponsored by Uprise Partners. Uprise launches startups and evolves established companies. Check it out at www.uprisepartners.com. Please like, subscribe, and share, and we'd love to hear from you. Give us a shout if you have a great idea that you want us to include. Just email us at hello@datamyths.com. Catch you next time.